your class?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah.
All right, here we go.
It's ready.
So our last thing in terms of what's going to be on the quiz tomorrow is just to sort of talk a little bit about asexual reproduction. So we've talked about mitosis and various stages. So mitosis is cell reproduction. It's how cells basically make copies of themselves, identical copies. And in some organisms, that process is used to make whole new organisms. So this is some review from 7th grade. So we know asexual reproduction does not involve gametes. There's no sex cells. Okay? The offspring that are produced are genetic copies of the original. They have basically the same DNA that the parent does. And most organisms that reproduce asexually are mostly simple organisms, unicellular organisms. Most of them use mitosis. And basically copy their genetic material, cell splits, and we have a new organism. Now, the term we use in some organisms is binary fission. And so this, technically in, for example, bacteria, the monarans, the process is technically not mitosis. What do bacteria lack that eukaryotes do have? They have no nuclear membrane. Okay. They also have sort of a different structure to their DNA. They have a long strand of DNA rather than individual packets of chromosomes. So the steps of mitosis, that's not really necessary in bacteria. In bacteria, binary fission, basically the DNA replicates, the strand of DNA replicates, and then splits apart and the cell splits apart. It's similar and accomplishes the same things in mitosis, but technically it's not mitosis. Okay? In some protists, like an amoeba, go through this process of binary fission where, yes, the nucleus splits through mitosis, and then the cell splits through cytokinesis, and we have two new cells. Some organisms use a process called budding. Budding is when it's not the entire organism just sort of splitting in two, but there's sort of an outgrowth from the parent organism that eventually splits off, breaks off, and becomes its own organism. For example, these are yeast. So this is an amoeba reproducing through binary fission. These are yeast cells, okay? Individual single-celled yeast, but they form these tiny little buds that eventually grow, break off, and become their own organism. But this is produced asexually. Here's a Hydra. Okay, again, a more advanced organism, an animal, but still can reproduce asexually. Hydra bud is growing off with the side of this adult Hydra, and this will eventually break off, and it becomes its own Hydra. It floats away and becomes its own. We know some organisms can reproduce through regeneration. Things we looked at back in 7th grade, like a planaria, which when cut in half, each half will grow the missing part, and then you have two organisms. A starfish can regenerate lost parts as long as there's a piece of a central disc present. And so sometimes they produce new organisms when there's damage, when there's some sort of trauma to the animal.
So did that little weird starfish?
Yeah, this
come
one
from
I
that
believe came off
starfish?
of this, one of the arms of this adult starfish. So yeah, this is growing. You can see the start of the new arms of the starfish that are beginning to grow.
It's like a hand.
Yeah. Sporulation is, spores are a way in which some organisms reproduce. Some can produce spores sexually, or they can sometimes be produced asexually. And basically a spore is a cell, often with a thick, hard coat that's sort of more durable, that can spread to a new area and start to grow into new organisms. For example, mold, like bread mold, reproduces through spores. And spores sort of float through the air. When they land in an area that's hospitable to their growth, then those spores can start to grow into a new organism. Plants reproduce can reproduce asexually. sometimes by natural means, other times we use certain methods in agriculture, in horticulture, to produce plants. And so some terms here: bulbs, runners, and tubers. A bulb is an underground piece of stem and leaves. And these, the bulb and the tuber, they're not primarily used for reproduction. You know, a bulb like, onions, or a tulip, or a tuber like a potato. What is their primary function? Like what is the purpose of potatoes producing this big underground structure? Sebastian?
To protect from predators that are trying to get the food.
I don't know, maybe partially. I'm thinking something else. Cormac? Yeah, it's for storage of nutrients. That plants, as they have plenty of sunshine and nutrients in the spring and summertime, can take much of that excess energy they're producing and store it in a tuber, store it in a bulb. And then, because over the winter, in many climates, it's dry, okay, there's not as much and not as direct sunlight, and so they can store that energy in the tuber, in the bulb, until the spring, and then utilize that energy to grow new shoots, new stems, new leaves, and so forth. So it's a means of sort of storing energy until it's needed. So bulbs are underground, fleshy leaves that store food. Sometimes new bulbs grow from the older bulbs. And if any of you, your parents maybe are gardeners, you know that if you dig up like a lily or daffodil out of the ground that's been growing for a while, that there will be several smaller bulbs connected to the original, and you can actually separate those smaller bulbs, plant them somewhere else, and they'll each grow into their own daffodil. It's called dividing them. Lots of plants, lots of perennials that people put in their gardens. You could do this. And so it's used both for storage of food, but also new plants can grow from it. And you see, if you imagine like an onion, did you ever have onions like in your house on the counter and you keep them for too long?
How does the potatoes?
And what starts to grow, they can start to grow on your counter. The new leaves can grow out of the stem of the onion. And what's the other end from where the leaves would come off? Yeah, there's roots. You can, when you buy an onion at the store, you can see there's just some little pieces left. But that's the part where there would be roots underneath that. So that onion is underground stem. That's what we harvest.
Have you ever had broccoli that flowered?
Yeah, I've had broccoli, and if you let it go too long.
Pretty.
Sometimes if you grow those fruits, like if you grow broccoli in a garden, if you don't harvest it quickly enough, it'll flower. That each of those tiny little green bulbs at the end of the broccoli will produce a flower. And so
Will it
if
grow
you don't,
out of broccoli?
yeah, it'll produce seeds and stuff. Yeah,
Wait. What color are the flowers?
they're yellowish. Like broccoli is one of the mustard family, and there's lots like Brussels sprouts and different broccoli, cauliflower. They're all sort of related to. They all evolved or were produced from sort of a wild mustard plant. Another forms of asexual reproduction are runners. Strawberries are the example we use a lot. Grass, spider plants, if you have them in your house, they grow through runners. And a runner is basically a horizontal stem that grows, across the surface of the soil. And then it touches down, and where it touches down, a new roots can grow, and that can eventually become a new plant. For example, in this strawberry plant, it sends out these runners over the surface of the ground, and where these nodes touch the soil, they'll start to grow roots, and then a new strawberry plant will grow. Sometimes this happens underground as well. The stems grow underground from place to place and then sprout up new plants. Tubers. Tubers are enlarged underground stems that contain food again. It's storage of food. But they also can grow into new plants. For example, a potato. Okay. A potato with those eyes. You know, you may have, if you have potatoes sitting around your counter too long, what starts to happen to those eyes? Yeah, they start to grow, right? And if you took a potato, chopped it up into a bunch of pieces, any piece that has an eye in it, you could plant in the ground and would start to grow new potato plant. But they would all be identical. They're all from the same parent. That's a form of asexual reproduction. Okay?
So what's really like the main difference between bulbs and tubers?
Between a bulb is sort of a fleshy, a tuber is sort of a fleshy, solid stem, whereas the bulb is actually, like, you know when you chop an onion, those are actually the leaves. They're modified leaves and stem all sort of together. There are also lots of artificial means that people have developed to produce plants, especially in agriculture. All of our agricultural vegetables and fruits and so forth, they all were produced by selective breeding of wild ancestors, tens of thousands of years ago often. And so once humans developed through artificial selection these crops that they liked, that taste good or produce large fruits and so forth, then we developed means of reproducing them asexually, because obviously if you have a great tomato plant that produces really great tomatoes, you want exact copies of that. And so by using these vegetative means of reproducing it, we're going to have the same types of tomatoes. Okay? And so some of those artificial means, cuttings. If you take a stem or a leaf off of a plant and you put it in water, if you put it in soil, the actual stem of that leaf will often grow new roots and will become its own plant. Okay. Geraniums are often cultured this way. Coleus is brightly colored plant that's used ornamentally in houses is often cultured this way. So you basically just cut a piece of the leaf or a stem off, put it in some water, and it will then start to grow. There are special hormones, rooting hormones, that you can actually put on that cutting that will encourage the growth of those roots, like auxin, like we talked about, also encourages the growth of roots. So you can do that. Grafting is pretty interesting. Grafting is often used in fruit production.
Mr. Ross, I heard that like through grafting you can have a tree grow multiple different types of fruits.
Yeah, you can. Grafting is when you take two different plants and sort of physically join them together so that they form a single unit. In the parts you graft, each part retains sort of its original characteristics. Okay. For example, the parts, often it's done when you have a plant that produces like a strong, hardy roots, and you want to use those strong, hardy roots to support some other type of fruit growing on those roots. So the bottom portion is usually called the stalk, the part that has the roots. Okay? And what you do, there's lots of different ways you do this. But basically you make and then you have the scion, which is the upper part with the leaves and the fruits that you're interested in actually growing. And you could take the scion, you sort of insert it into a cut in the stalk, sort of seal it up with tape, they seal it with wax sometimes, and what will happen is the vascular tissue, the xylem and phloem, between these plants will sort of reconnect, will grow, and then we have on the top a single fruit or a single type of plant grafted onto the roots of another plant. Sometimes it's used like, if you have like landscaping around your house, sometimes they have those umbrella plants where they grow on like a short, straight stem, and then they have branches that sort of flow like this. If you look at those, often those are produced by grafting. If you have one of those around your house, look at it, because you can still see, if you go and you look underneath that, you can see where the graft was, because this area where they were grafted forms this sort of swollen area where you had the stalk attached to the scion. So yeah, like Antonio said, you can graft, if they're similar species especially, you could graft two types of apples onto one rootstock, and then it'll look like it's a single apple tree, and it'll grow, golden delicious apples on some parts, and it'll grow, Macintosh apples on the other parts. So you can graft multiple parts onto a single rootstock.
Wait, that's an actual kind of apple, Macintosh?
Yeah.
Hey.
Never heard of Macintosh apple?
Oh.
All right. Any questions about asexual reproduction in plants? All right, that's all we need to finish for our quiz.
That's why there's a company.
That's why they're called
computers.
Macintosh. Apple.
Oh, I get that.